Now, as Israeli Prime Minister Bennett mentioned, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid is currently in London right now for a 2-day trip to the United Kingdom and France. And one of the primary concerns is to ensure that banking sanctions against Iran remain in place. Now, in October of 2020, Trump sanctioned 18 Iranian banks and gave foreign companies 45 days to cease business with them or risk secondary sanctions. And this was an attempt to cut off Iran's ability to fund its proxy groups. Well, Iran is coming to Vienna determined to have those very sanctions removed. So we're going to have to wait and see if Lapid's back-to-back meetings with British and French officials alike will have an impact. But joining us now to break down what we can expect out of these talks is Middle East expert Avi Melamed, the founder of the Middle East Intelligence Perspective. So Avi, first of all, give us a breakdown of what today is going to look like for negotiators in Vienna. Who's involved in these negotiations and who is going to be at the forefront of talks?
Well, good morning. Yes, indeed, today they're going to resume the talks. The regular players, roughly speaking, you got the 5+1, the same countries that signed the JCPOA back in 2015, and of course, the Iranians. There are no expectations today to some dramatic news coming out of this first day. It seems like all the sides are basically trying to lower expectations. So therefore, I guess we should be looking at some kind of like an ongoing, lingering process.
Now, what do both sides want to see happen? What could bring them to an agreement?
Well, the Iranian regime would like to see the immediate removal of all the sanctions without any conditions. For the Iranian regime, that would be the ultimate triumph in every possible aspect. It's much more complicated when you look at the question from the Western perspectives, because on the one hand, the Western leaders do acknowledge today that the JCPOA had a lot of flaws. We actually have witnessed and suffered the very bitter fruits of the JCPOA for the last couple of years, not only in the context of the violation of every possible element of the agreement by the Iranians in terms of the nuclear program, but mostly in the context of the tripling and boosting aggression of the Iranians in the region, namely the armed militias, the ballistic missiles, the drones, and so on and so on. The issue is that it seems like while Iran is speaking in one very clear, solid voice, the Western powers are speaking in different voices, and that's, by the way, one of the background for the immediate visit of the Israeli foreign minister to the UK and France.
Now, analysts seem to be very pessimistic about any breakthrough actually being made in these talks. Israel, for its part, as we know, is starkly against re-entering the deal. So what is Israel doing on the sidelines? And you just, mentioned Lapid, of course, in his trip to the UK and France. What can we expect out of that?
Well, we know that Israel maintains a lot of pressure, and the pressure is quite known. And the Israeli perspective is very clear. And Israel has a very good reasons to be concerned, not only with the issue of the Iranian nuclear project, but the issue of the fact that once sanctions are going to be lifted, Iran could further triple and stream gazillions of dollars to its proxies, including in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza Strip. And we all know what's the ramifications of that. But there is another player that has to be noticed. And these are the Gulf states who are clearly sending more and more clear messages to the West, saying, if we will come to the conclusion that you are failing to prevent an Iranian nuclear capacities, we will not stand aside.
Now, I'd like to get a breakdown of why we saw such a long hiatus in negotiations. Why did we see this hiatus?
It's the bazaar. It's the Iranian bazaar. The Iranian regime felt that the Iranian regime reads very well the dichotomy, the schizophrenic, I would say, approach of the West. And he plays with that. Now, he is totally oblivious of the suffer of its own people. Needless to say that the Iranian regime couldn't care less about the suffer of Syrians or Iraqis or Israelis or Palestinians or Yemenites or whatever. So he can play the game as much as he wants. And this is one of the biggest weaknesses, because the West has failed constantly to make the Iranian regime understand that the West this time is going to be very determined. And the Iranian regime reads that weakness and plays along, and he plays its cards very well. That's the reason why he was prolonging, dragging his feet in the context of all this discussion. And we could expect some more other tweaks coming from the Iranian hands.
Now, if a deal were to actually be made, what kind of response could we see from Israel? And I'm more particularly interested in understanding how that would impact Israel-U.S. relations if we were to see the United States re-enter a nuclear deal with Iran.
Well, we could say already that it evokes some frictions between the current government and the American administration. We should notice that differently from the Netanyahu's administration that was like on a very open collision with Obama's administration around that issue, and differently from the time where President Trump was in term, this time, at least up until now, relatively speaking, the relationship between the Israeli government and the American administration were quite good and solid, including reminding you the support of Biden administration in Israel during the war against Hamas on May 2021. But the frictions are there, the differences of opinions are there. And in the end of the day, Israel has a very significant element which relatively does not exist in the case of the United States or the European, but from Israel it's a very significant one. Israel is facing a very serious threat, the Iranian threat. I'm not talking only about the Iranian nuclear capacity, I'm talking about everything that I mentioned before. And this is a very severe and serious threat. Mm-hmm. And I don't know to say if the Western leaders fully internalized, other than making statements, I don't know if they fully internalized how severe this threat is to the state of Israel. We just have to think about the huge infrastructure of missiles and accurate missiles that the Iranians are trying to build around Israel's neck in Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza Strip. I'm not sure to say that the Western leaders understand the severity of this threat.
Well, obviously, we're going to have to wait and see how this plays out. Again, it is obviously, I guess you could say, an exciting day that we are seeing negotiations resumed on all ends. Everybody is watching. Israelis as well are watching to see what is going to happen here. I'd like to thank you, Avi, for joining us and breaking that down. We are now going to be taking a